First class is reserved for paying passengers. Please return to your assigned seat in economy. The word struck Jasmine Carter like a slap, sharp and humiliating. She stood frozen in the aisle of the aircraft, boarding pass still in hand, trying to process what had just been said. The flight attendant, Melissa Harding, didn't blink. Her voice was firm, her smile thin and professional, but her eyes said everything else. Cold. Doubtful. Dismissive. I am in first class, Jasmine said, holding up the printed ticket as if it might prove her very existence. Seat 2A. This is mine. Melissa didn't even glance at the pass. She crossed her arms. I'm going to have to verify that, she said. Wait here, miss. Behind Jasmine, passengers shifted impatiently. A few sighed. One man let out a quiet laugh, the kind that came not from humor but from disbelief. She could feel them staring. Judging. Watching. Her hands tightened on her carry-on strap, but her face stayed composed. She'd been taught better than to give in to embarrassment in public. Especially in places where people already assumed she didn't belong. Melissa came back within minutes, not with an apology, but with escalation. There's been a mix-up. That seat's assigned to someone else now. Please move to economy, or I'll have to call security. And just like that, a 17-year-old girl, polite, well-dressed, traveling alone for the first time in months, was being publicly dismissed. Not for what she did, not for causing trouble, but because of what Melissa saw when she looked at her, a black teenager who didn't fit the first-class image. No one stepped in. No one asked questions. No one said, let her sit. The humiliation settled into Jasmine's chest like a slow, burning coal. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just lowered her eyes, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and turned toward the back of the plane. What no one knew, not Melissa, not the passengers, not even the other flight attendants, was that Jasmine Carter wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of David Carter, the man who built Skystar Airlines from the ground up. The man who owned this plane, this crew, this company. The man who didn't like it when people disrespected his daughter. And he was waiting for her text. 15 minutes earlier, Jasmine had stepped confidently through the first-class gate at Atlanta International Airport, boarding pass in hand. She had flown commercial many times, never flaunting who her father was, never name-dropping. That wasn't how she was raised. Her father always said, let your presence speak before your name ever does. Today was supposed to be special. She had just finished her senior year and earned a full scholarship to USC. Her father had arranged the ticket, first class, of course. Not because she asked for it, but because he wanted her to feel celebrated. Respected. Jasmine was quiet by nature. The kind of girl who observed before speaking. The kind who remembered names, smiled at gate agents, and always said thank you to flight crews. She didn't wear designer labels, but her presence had grace. She didn't need to tell people who she was. But Melissa Harding never asked. She didn't ask who Jasmine was. She just saw who she wasn't. When Jasmine first handed over her ticket, Melissa looked it over, then looked her up and down. Noticing the clean but simple outfit. The lack of a luxury handbag. The skin. The hair. She smiled politely. But her voice said something else. Are you sure you're in the right place? The problem wasn't Jasmine's seat. It was the assumption that she didn't belong in it. Now, seated in row 26D near the rear of the aircraft, Jasmine looked out the window, her phone resting in her lap. The message she hadn't yet sent blinked on her screen. They made me move to economy. She read it twice. Took a breath. Then tapped send. Her father replied instantly. Stay calm. I'm making a call now. What Jasmine didn't know was that her father had already called the airline's operations director, then the chief pilot on duty, and then someone else. Someone who could get a call directly to the cockpit of the plane she was on. And somewhere at 36,000 feet, that call was about to be answered. But back in coach, Jasmine sat quietly, her legs crossed, her face unreadable. Around her, passengers murmured. Some had seen the scene. Most hadn't cared. She wasn't trying to make anyone uncomfortable. She just wanted to get home. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about what it represented: respect, fairness, recognition. She opened her notebook and tried to read over a few scholarship essays she had written earlier that month, but the words blurred. She couldn't focus. The shame was heavy. Not because she wasn't supposed to be there, but because she knew she never should have been moved. At the front of the plane, Melissa Harding moved through first class with ease. Serving champagne, adjusting pillows, offering warm towels. She smiled, laughed with a businessman, complimented a woman's diamond earrings. But deep inside, she still felt the heat of suspicion. Something about that girl. Something didn't sit right. She didn't even argue, Melissa whispered to her fellow attendant. Just gave me attitude. Typical. The attendant didn't respond. 10 rows back, a woman leaned toward her husband and said softly, that girl never raised her voice. And yet they still pulled her out of first class. He nodded but said nothing. In the cabin, silence lingered. And then, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It wasn't the usual sit back and relax kind of tone. It was firmer. Focused. Flight crew, please report to the forward galley. Melissa stood, smoothing her jacket, her confidence unshaken. Probably just routine. She made her way up front, heels clicking down the aisle. But when she stepped into the galley, the captain was already waiting. His face wasn't angry. It was measured. Controlled. Miss Harding, he said, I've just received a direct call from Mr. David Carter. Melissa froze. The owner, she asked, her voice suddenly dry. He nodded. His daughter is on this flight. And he has concerns about how she's been treated. Melissa's stomach dropped. And in that moment, for the first time in her long, proud career, she realized she had just made the gravest mistake of her life. And the flight had only just begun. Melissa Harding stood in the galley, her back straight and her hands folded, trying to hold on to the illusion of composure as the captain spoke the words she had never expected to hear in her career. Mr. David Carter has concerns about the way his daughter was treated on this flight. His voice was even, but the weight of the message behind it landed like thunder. Melissa didn't speak. For a split second, she hoped this was some bizarre coincidence, a misunderstanding. Maybe there had been another black girl on board, maybe the captain was mistaken. But no, she knew. The name sounded too familiar now, too certain, too final. David Carter. The man behind Skystar Airlines. The name on every training manual, every company email footer, every leadership award hanging in the corporate offices. And his daughter? That soft-spoken girl she had dismissed, ignored, and ordered out of first class, Jasmine, was her. The captain didn't offer further conversation. He gave her a look that said, in no uncertain terms, you've done enough damage. He turned and returned to the cockpit, leaving Melissa standing there with a hollow silence pressing in around her. She stood still for a moment, trying to process, trying to replay what had happened. Had Jasmine ever raised her voice? No. Had she caused a scene? No. Had she done anything at all, that warranted what Melissa had done? No. Melissa had made a judgment, a snap decision, based solely on how that girl looked. And now, the consequences were circling back faster than she could brace for them. Back in row 26D, Jasmine Carter sat quietly, her back pressed against the seat, her phone dark in her lap. She had seen Melissa walk past earlier, had caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the change in her expression, the falter in her step. Jasmine knew something had shifted. Her father hadn't responded again, but he didn't need to. If he said he was making a call, she trusted that something was already in motion. Jasmine turned her gaze to the window, where clouds drifted by in layers of white and gray, endless and silent. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't even feel vindicated. Just tired. Tired of having to prove she belonged, tired of the way some people needed titles or names before they could show basic respect. She didn't want to humiliate Melissa. She wanted to understand why it always had to come to this. Across the aisle, an older woman leaned slightly toward her. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "That wasn't right, what happened back there," she said gently. Jasmine looked over, surprised. "You handled it with a lot of grace. I don't think I could have stayed that calm." Jasmine offered a small, polite smile, the kind that said thank you, but I don't really want to talk right now. The woman nodded, understanding, and leaned back in her seat. It was the first moment of human kindness Jasmine had received since boarding the plane. Meanwhile, Melissa was trying to recalibrate. She walked briskly through first class, refilling water glasses and offering snacks, but her mind wasn't on her routine. She couldn't focus. She spilled a cup of tea into a saucer and muttered an apology. She offered a warm towel to the same passenger twice. Her co-attendants began to notice the change in her demeanor. One of them pulled her aside near the curtain. "You good?" she asked. Melissa nodded too quickly. "Yeah. Fine. Just a bit off today." But her fingers trembled as she adjusted the coffee pot. Something had cracked. And it was only going to get worse. 15 minutes later, Melissa did something she never thought she'd do. She picked up a tray and walked it all the way down to economy. She paused a row before Jasmine's, exhaled, then stepped forward. Jasmine looked up. Their eyes met. "Miss Carter," Melissa began, her voice quieter than usual, stripped of confidence. "Can I get you something? A drink? Snack? I wanted to apologize for earlier." Jasmine blinked. Her expression was calm but unreadable. "No, thank you," she said softly. "I'm fine." Melissa hesitated. She stood there awkwardly for a moment, then nodded and walked away, the tray still in her hands. She returned 10 minutes later, offering an extra blanket, a hot towel, and even an upgraded meal tray. Jasmine declined each one with the same composed expression. Passengers nearby began to take notice. One whispered to another, "That's the same flight attendant who kicked her out of first class, isn't it?" Another replied, "Why is she being so nice now?" Someone else muttered, "She must have found out who that girl really is." Jasmine knew exactly what was happening. Melissa wasn't apologizing because she understood. She was apologizing because she was scared. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about damage control. But Jasmine didn't offer comfort. She didn't make it easy. She sat there with the quiet power of someone who had nothing left to prove. Half an hour passed. Melissa returned again, this time without props or offerings. She knelt slightly beside Jasmine's row and said in a lower voice, "I just want to say again, I'm sorry. I didn't realize who you were." Jasmine turned her head. Her gaze was direct, clear. "That's the problem," she said. "You wouldn't have treated me that way if you had known. But you did, because you didn't. And that's worse." Melissa's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jasmine continued, her voice still calm. "The matter's not in my hands anymore. My father's handling it." Melissa's face drained of color. For a moment she just stood there, then backed away slowly. She returned to first class, her footsteps hollow. At the front of the plane, whispers were growing louder. Passengers had pieced together bits of the story. Some had seen Melissa's earlier behavior. Others had overheard the captain on the intercom or watched Melissa's sudden shift in demeanor. Something was clearly going on. And then, through the plane's small windows, a sleek black SUV was spotted pulling up directly beside the arriving gate. The cabin stirred. Someone whispered, "That's not just a pickup car. That's someone important." Someone else said, "Is that David Carter?" Jasmine remained still. Her phone buzzed once. She looked down. A message from her father, "I'm here. Stay seated." The final descent was smooth. The landing gentle. But the atmosphere aboard was electric. Passengers stayed in their seats longer than usual, watching, waiting. As the seatbelt sign switched off, no one stood. Then, the door opened. And in stepped David Carter. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit. His presence filled the cabin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. People parted instinctively. He walked straight past first class, past rows of curious faces and craned necks, and stopped when he reached his daughter. Jasmine stood. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," she replied. "I'm okay now." He nodded once, then turned. His eyes met Melissa's. The rest of the cabin fell silent. David Carter took a breath, and then said the words that would change everything. "Miss Harding, we need to have a conversation. Right now." And as every eye in that aircraft turned toward her, Melissa realized there was no more hiding. The flight was over. But her reckoning had just begun. Melissa Harding's legs felt numb as she followed David Carter to the front of the cabin. The world around her blurred, passengers whispering, crew members averting their eyes, tension thick enough to choke on. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. The curtain separating the galley from the cabin swished shut behind them, muffling the sound of the terminal beyond. But in the space between them, silence thundered. David turned slowly to face her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly or threaten. That would have been easier to take. What he did instead was far worse. He looked at her. Not with rage. Not even with disappointment. With clarity. Like a man who'd seen this kind of behavior before. Like someone who had carried the weight of prejudice too long to be surprised by it. "Do you know why I'm here, Miss Harding?" he asked, voice low and steady. She opened her mouth to respond, but all that came out was a dry whisper. "Sir, I didn't know who she was." David's jaw tensed. "And if she weren't my daughter?" he asked. "If she were just another young black girl flying alone, what would have happened then? Would you have called security? Removed her again? Laughed about it with your colleagues like it was nothing?" Melissa flushed deep crimson. She looked down, suddenly wishing she were anywhere else. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I just thought." "You thought wrong," David said, cutting her off, his voice still eerily calm. "You thought she didn't belong. You looked at her and saw a problem to solve, not a person to respect. And you made that judgment in front of a cabin full of people." She looked up at him now, panic rising in her chest. "Sir, I've worked for this airline for over 10 years. I've never had a complaint." He shook his head. "You just haven't been caught." That stopped her. "The only reason this came to light is because you picked the wrong girl today," he continued. "But the truth is, what you did to Jasmine, you've probably done to others. People who didn't have the power or the name to challenge it." The words hit harder than anything she had expected. It was like standing in front of a mirror she hadn't looked into in years, and not liking what stared back. David stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough that only she could hear. "Let me be clear. This isn't about my daughter. This is about how we treat people when we think no one's watching. And today, Miss Harding, everyone was watching." He pulled back the curtain, re-entering the cabin with a commanding calm. Melissa followed, dazed, like a shadow of her former self. Passengers turned as they reappeared, silence stretching like a held breath. David didn't hesitate. "To everyone still on board," he said, "I want to address what happened on this flight." A few phones lifted suddenly. Someone began recording. "My daughter, Jasmine Carter, was removed from her assigned first-class seat, not because of an error or her behavior, but because of how she looked. That is unacceptable. And it does not reflect the values of this airline." His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Truth, when spoken plainly, is the loudest sound in the room. We pride ourselves on professionalism, fairness, and dignity. But today, that was broken. And I promise you, it will not be ignored. He turned to his assistant standing near the cockpit door. Miss Harding is hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Melissa's knees nearly buckled. But no one stepped in to defend her. No one argued. Because no one could. David turned back to Jasmine, standing a few rows behind him now, eyes fixed on her father. Let's go, he said gently. And just like that, they walked out together. No applause. No dramatic music. Just the echo of footsteps, and the silence left behind when Justice enters quietly. Back at the galley, Melissa stood still. Her badge hung heavy around her neck. She looked down at her hands, suddenly unsure of what they had done. For years, she'd prided herself on poise, procedure, and professionalism. But today, none of those things had stopped her from making a decision born out of bias. She had assumed. She had acted. And now, she was facing the cost. She pulled off her name tag and stared at it in her palm. Maybe it had never meant what she thought it did. And for the first time in her decade-long career, Melissa Harding felt small. Not because someone had shamed her, but because she had shamed herself. Outside the aircraft, a different kind of flight was preparing for takeoff. The truth, now airborne. And it wasn't coming down anytime soon. The terminal windows shimmered with morning light as Jasmine Carter stepped onto solid ground. The cool tile beneath her feet, the distant murmur of boarding calls, the gentle rumble of a luggage cart rolling by, all of it felt strangely quiet compared to the storm she had just weathered in the sky. Beside her, David Carter walked with the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them carried the weight of everything that had just happened, every judgmental glance, every moment of humiliation. Every ounce of composure she had fought to maintain while being treated like she didn't belong. And now, the girl they had forced out of first class had walked out of that cabin like a queen returning from exile, her father, the man who built the airline they dared to gatekeep, at her side. Jasmine clutched her carry-on a little tighter. The real flight, she thought, was just beginning. By the time David returned to headquarters, the news had already made its way there. A junior social media associate had spotted a trending post, young black girl kicked out of first class, turns out her dad owns the airline. Beneath it, a grainy video clip was racking up shares. It showed Jasmine standing calmly at the front of the plane, holding her boarding pass, while Melissa's voice, sharp, dismissive, echoed off the cabin walls. There were hashtags now, hashtag she belonged, hashtag respect in the skies, hashtag Carter Airlines accountable. And behind them, there were thousands of stories. People sharing their own moments of being dismissed, talked down to, looked at like they didn't fit the mold. This wasn't just one girl on one flight anymore. It was a mirror. David Carter didn't flinch. He didn't call PR. He didn't ask legal to draft a statement. Instead, he called a meeting. Executives shuffled into the boardroom that afternoon with cautious energy. They knew the temperature had changed. The usual corporate small talk died at the door. David stood at the head of the long oak table, hands folded, his face unreadable. Then he spoke. "I'm not here to fix a headline," he began. "I'm here to fix the problem." He paused, letting the silence bite. What happened to Jasmine was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, something we've allowed to fester beneath a polished surface. We've trained staff to prioritize protocol, but not people. We've let bias wear the mask of professionalism. And now, the mask is off. No one moved. No one interrupted. David continued, "We will be launching an immediate internal audit of every frontline department, flight attendants, gate agents, supervisors. We're implementing mandatory anti-bias and inclusion training, not just once, not just for show, but embedded into every layer of this company. Evaluations will include anonymous passenger feedback. And any staff member who refuses to align with our values will be let go." He didn't threaten. He promised. Outside the boardroom, the internet kept spinning. Interviews were requested. Journalists reached out. Jasmine, however, remained quiet. She didn't post. Didn't tweet. Didn't give a single quote. That silence became its own kind of power. Because while others talked, she listened. And she watched. Back home, she sat by her bedroom window as the sun dipped low. Her phone buzzed constantly, notifications, messages from strangers, classmates, even people she hadn't heard from in years. But she didn't answer. She was thinking about the girl she'd been the moment she stepped onto that plane. The one who had just earned a scholarship, who had been excited to fly home in a first-class seat not because of the luxury, but because it meant something. It meant she had arrived somewhere. That she mattered. And then, someone tried to take that from her with a single sentence, "You don't belong here." But Jasmine hadn't broken. She hadn't raised her voice or stormed off. She had stood still. And in doing so, she had made the world move. Meanwhile, Melissa Harding had been formally placed on unpaid leave. The disciplinary review was underway. And for the first time in her professional life, Melissa had no defense. She sat at her kitchen table that evening staring at her uniform, neatly folded, resting on the back of a chair. It looked smaller now. Less like something she wore and more like a costume she'd outgrown. Her mind replayed the moment David Carter looked at her and said, "You just didn't bother to find out who she was." It echoed in her chest like a verdict. She opened her laptop. She didn't draft a rebuttal. She didn't search for excuses. She opened a blank email and began typing. "Dear Mr. Carter, I won't pretend that I didn't know what I was doing. I saw your daughter and I made a decision before she ever opened her mouth. I judged her. I dismissed her. I didn't just fail your airline, I failed myself." The message was long. Raw. She didn't ask for her job back. She didn't beg. But she asked for something else, a chance to learn. A chance to change. David received the email the next morning. He read it slowly. Once. Then twice. And then he picked up the phone, not to call HR, not to call legal, but to call Jasmine. "You need to read this," he said. Jasmine read the message in silence. When she was done, she set the phone down and sat with it. She didn't know if it was real remorse or just fear of consequences. But that wasn't her call. She looked at her father. "What are you going to do?" David leaned back in his chair. "What would you do?" Jasmine thought about that. About how easy it would be to say fire her. About how satisfying it might feel. But something deeper stirred in her. Something her father had taught her long before this flight. "I think you already did the hard part," she said softly. "You made her see herself." David nodded. "Then we'll watch what she does with that." In the weeks that followed, Sky High Airlines launched a campaign titled "Everyone Belongs Here." It wasn't just an ad, it was a culture shift. Training sessions were led by outside experts, including activists, psychologists, and even former passengers who had experienced discrimination in the skies. Employees were encouraged to speak up, to share, to listen. Some quit. Others stayed. And some, like Melissa, chose to come back, not as who they were, but as who they were becoming. Jasmine didn't lead the campaign. She didn't want the spotlight. But her story led it. Quietly. Powerfully. One afternoon, months later, Jasmine boarded another flight. Same airline. Same seat, 1A. A different crew this time. But something had changed. She could feel it. The attendant smiled at her, looked her in the eye, and simply said, "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter." She smiled back. "Thank you." The flight took off. And as the clouds pulled back below her, Jasmine leaned her head against the window. She wasn't flying first class anymore. She was flying on her own terms. Because belonging was never about the seat. It was about the truth. And once spoken, that truth had wings. Months passed, but the memory of that flight never left the hearts of those who witnessed it. For some, it was a lesson they hadn't known they needed. For others, it was a mirror held up to the systems they had participated in, knowingly or not. And for Jasmine Carter, it became a quiet turning point, one that didn't define her, but undeniably shaped her. She didn't speak out in public interviews. She didn't post threads on social media or hold press conferences. Instead, she returned to her studies, focused on her work, and lived her life with the same quiet dignity that had once held her upright in the aisle of that plane. But beneath her calm surface, something had changed. She understood, more than ever, that sometimes the most powerful protest isn't loud, it's standing your ground when the world wants you to shrink. At Sky High Airlines, the ripples of that day turned into waves. The Everyone Belongs Here campaign launched by David Carter had grown into a full-fledged initiative. Not just training modules, not just posters on break room walls. It became culture. Flight attendants were given the space to talk about their own biases. Supervisors were trained on what microaggressions looked like in real time. For the first time, employees weren't just expected to perform, they were expected to reflect. Some resisted. A few longtime staff members quit, unwilling to adapt to what they called oversensitivity. But many stayed. And among those who remained, change started to take root, not because they feared punishment, but because they began to understand. They saw themselves in Jasmine. In the countless stories submitted by passengers in anonymous surveys. They began to listen. Melissa Harding returned to work under strict probation. Not everyone agreed with the decision. Some said she should have been fired and never looked back. But David Carter believed that growth couldn't happen if people were discarded the moment they failed. He had seen something in Melissa's letter, a rare kind of honesty that came not from damage control, but from genuine remorse. Her first few weeks back weren't easy. Colleagues kept their distance. Passengers occasionally recognized her face and watched her more closely than others. But Melissa didn't shrink from the discomfort. She leaned into it. She asked to be retrained from the ground up. She sat through the same workshops as new hires. And when the time came, she stood before her team and told her story, not to make excuses, but to admit what she had done and who she had been. "I didn't think I was that kind of person," she said once during a staff training. "But I was. And I think that's the part that scares me the most. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I just assumed. And that assumption was enough to humiliate a young woman who deserved better. Who earned her place. And I made her feel like she had to prove it. I won't ever do that again." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for accountability. And with time, respect began to return, not because people forgot what she had done, but because they saw how far she was willing to go to make it right. As for Jasmine, she remained somewhat of a mystery to the public. But to the airline staff, her story became part of orientation. New hires watched a dramatized video of the incident, not to shame Melissa, but to remind employees that every decision, every assumption, every sentence spoken at 35,000 feet could change someone's life. On the anniversary of that flight, Sky High held a private company event, small, quiet, no cameras. David Carter stood in front of his team and spoke not as a CEO, but as a father. He talked about what it meant to watch his daughter be diminished in front of strangers. He talked about the quiet strength it took for her not to retaliate. And then, he said something no one expected. "She taught me something that day," he said. "I've spent years building this company, thinking I could protect my family from everything. But Jasmine reminded me that dignity isn't something you can hand to someone. It's something they carry. And if we want to be the kind of airline we say we are, then we need to carry that dignity for every person who walks onto our planes, no matter what they wear, what they look like, or where they come from." The room was silent. But something shifted that night. A collective breath released. A shared understanding that what had happened on that flight wasn't just one story. It was a seed. And from that seed, something better was growing. Later that year, Jasmine boarded another Sky High flight. This time, no one questioned her seat. No one asked for proof. The flight attendant smiled, offered her a drink, and treated her with the same kindness they offered everyone else. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, watching clouds drift below her window. She wasn't flying because she needed to prove anything. She was flying because she belonged. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've seen or felt or lived through, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Because someone out there may still be waiting to hear that they belong too. And if you believe that dignity, respect, and justice should never come with a price tag, then help us spread that message. Subscribe to Disrespected Stories, where every voice matters and every injustice has a reckoning. Like this video if it spoke to your heart. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been underestimated? Judged too soon? Or stood up for someone when it mattered most? This is more than a story. This is a movement. And here on Disrespected Stories, you're part of it.